to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Romina Itron, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications.
Hi, Ro. How are you?
Fine. Thank you, Tim. So we're taping this on a Friday, and we've got some new developments on the recall this past week. Last week, Larry Elder didn't make it to the preliminary list of candidates, and he challenged the state, took them to court because the state has said that he had some deficiencies in his filing, but he fought it, and now he's back on the ballot.
Yeah, it was interesting. The judge in the case ruled basically two things. One, the state changed the law, and it was in response to Donald Trump not filing his tax returns, to require that presidential candidates and gubernatorial candidates have to file 5 years of taxes as a condition of getting on the ballot. Well, the courts already struck down before the 2020 election the issue for presidential candidates, but it was kind of out there for gubernatorial candidates, and also whether that law applied to the recall. So the judge ruled that it didn't apply to the recall because the law says it's only for a primary election. And they also ruled that even if the law did apply, that Larry Elder had complied basically with the requirements of the law.
Well, that's good news for him. But I thought was also kind of interesting is a polling that you sent around yesterday.
Yeah, there's a new big poll out from Emerson College and the Next Star stations in California. And they found that it's actually a pretty tight race for the recall. Right now, it's yes 43, no 48, with 9% undecided. And that is an increase of 5% for the yes side since the prior poll from Next Star and Emerson College in March. And this contrasts with other recent polling that showed that the recall was trailing by double digits. So there's a real horse race on. And the interesting thing is that this polling comes after Governor Newsom has spent tens of millions of dollars in advertising against the recall. So, I think we're in for an interesting rest of the way here until September 14th. Dragging down the governor in this polling, they asked voters to rate how the governor is doing on various issues. On the issue of homelessness, for example, 52% of Californians said that Governor Newsom was doing a poor job handling homelessness. And if you add in those who said he was doing a fair job, 77% said that he was doing a fair or poor job. They asked him how he was doing on COVID, which the governor kind of touts as his great moment. 33% said he did a poor job, the most of the four potential answers that you could give. When you add in fair, 52% of Californians said that he did a fair or poor job handling COVID. Similar numbers on his handling of the drought. 63% said he was doing either a fair or poor job handling the drought, and 58% said he was doing a fair or poor job handling wildfires. So there clearly is some real fundamental weaknesses here for Governor Newsom. They also asked, kind of the standard question, do you approve or disapprove of the governor's job overall? And his approval rating was only at 49%, with 42% disapproving. That's way down from even recent polling numbers where he was, getting near 60% approval rating. So we're in for an interesting race to September 14th.
Well, Tim, I kind of believe that if this Delta variant surges in California even more than it is doing now, that there's this risk that Newsom might want to close the schools again. I know he's getting some pressure on that, put masks back on the kids and put masks back on everyone. And that can't go well for his candidacy.
That's right. There are a lot of big political landmines out there. The Delta variant, of course, the mask mandate. Are schools going to reopen, even though he says they are going to reopen? Are they going to fully reopen to in-person learning? And then you have issues with wildfires. We could be getting to $5 a gasoline. And then you're going to, the drought, of course, and then the potential for power blackouts. There is going to be a lot of sweating over the next few weeks with, issues that could overshadow Newsom's efforts to fight the recall at just the wrong time?
There was some early polling you showed me yesterday from the challengers, and they were actually some of them were doing surprisingly well, more than we ever thought.
It's an interesting question, right? You have two questions. Do you want to recall the governor, yes or no? And then if the governor is recalled, who would you want to replace him? And one of the things that I think is interesting is, will people who vote no on the recall, will they vote in the replace election? And there's also not a big name Democrat on the ballot. So there's a question of, well, what are those people going to do? So right now, in this latest Nexstar Emerson College poll, they asked people how they would vote in the second ballot, and undecided leads with 53% of the vote. Larry Elder comes in first with 16% of the vote, and he's significantly ahead of his closest competitors, which are John Cox and Kevin Faulconer, tied at 6% each. Then you have Kevin Kiley and Caitlyn Jenner tied at 4%. Say lightning strikes and Gavin Newsom actually is narrowly recalled. Could you have the replacement governor elected with 20% of the vote or less? So there's going to be a lot of interesting questions about if Newsom is actually recalled, how will that replacement governor actually govern, if they're elected with a quarter of the vote or less?
There's also the what if, Tim. What if the Republicans powwowed, got together a few months earlier and decided amongst themselves who would challenge Newsom? The vote might be more consolidated now, and there might be a real horse race.
And there actually are some efforts to do that. The Republican Party has been debating whether they should change the rules to allow for a party endorsement. And the conventional wisdom is that they would likely endorse Kevin Faulconer. But even Kevin Faulconer said this week, his campaign did, that they don't think at this point, they don't think the party should endorse a candidate, that it would be too divisive. So we will see what happens. But you're exactly right. Should everyone have brought together all these, names in a room and, didn't let anybody leave until they agreed upon who the candidate would be?
Well, these are interesting times ahead for California. So turning to this podcast, our guest is Judge Janice Brown, who was an associate justice in the California Supreme Court and a judge on the DC Court of Appeals. Now, Judge Brown takes on this huge issue, woke ideology, what it means in our public schools, our college campuses, corporations, sports, our legal system, and especially how it threatens our Constitution and America's institutions. We also have a terrific moderator, Judge Daniel Kolkey, who was a justice on California's Court of Appeals and also counsel to Governor Pete Wilson, and of course, a member of the PRI's board. So identity politics is such a huge issue today. And because of cancel culture, few people want to take it on. So we're so thankful for the courage of Judge Brown and Judge Kolkey for taking on these issues head on.
Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar by Pacific Research Institute. As a reminder, Pacific Research Institute is a nonprofit free market think tank that does research in a whole series of topics, including healthcare, the environment, economics, reform for California. And today we're going to address critical race theory and woke ideology. Our speaker today is Judge Janice Rogers Brown, who's going to speak on, quote, bait and switch, how the wokerati mislead the public for power and profit. Now, before I formally introduce Judge Brown, let me just give you a little bit about her background. She was born in Alabama. She was the daughter of a sharecropper. And from those very humble beginnings, she reached the heights of the judicial system in the United States. In 1994, Judge Brown was appointed by Governor Wilson to the California Court of Appeal, 3rd Appellate District in Sacramento. 2 years later, Governor Wilson appointed her to the California Supreme Court as an associate justice, where she served until 2005, at which time President George W. Bush appointed her as a circuit judge for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. And there, Judge Brown served with distinction and honor from 2005 to 2017. And in fact, Judge Brown has had a very impressive career even before she became a judge. For instance, after she graduated from law school in 1977, she was deputy legislative counsel for the California Legislative Counsel's Office, which frankly drafts all of the legislation for the legislators in the California legislature. She then served for 8 years as the Deputy Attorney General in the California Department of Justice. And thereafter, she was a Deputy Secretary and General Counsel of a major California agency, the California Agency for Housing, Transportation, and Business. And after that, a short stint in private practice, and she became Governor Wilson's Legal Affairs Secretary during his first term in office. So since her retirement, Judge Brown has been studying critical race theory and the woke literati. So she has got some very interesting remarks today. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Judge Janice Rogers Brown. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And hello to all of you who have joined us virtually. This is a subject that I think a lot of people are thinking about now. So I'm going to just get right into it. Roughly 250 years. Is that the lifespan to be carved in the headstone of the American Republic? Maybe the end date will be 2025 or 2030. The point is, if the woke elite have their way, nothing of the liberty and commitment to self-government that has marked America as an exceptional nation will survive. Abraham Lincoln once implored the Congress to do everything in their power to save, quote, the last best hope of Earth. America's woke vanguard has reached a different conclusion. Their evaluation of this nation echoes the judgment God announced to King Belshazzar just before the fall of the Babylonian kingdom. Mene Tekel Upharsin, a phrase translated in part as "you have been weighed and found wanting." The book of Daniel tells us Babylon surrendered to its besiegers within hours of that ominous message appearing on the wall, and the king was killed that very night. For many of us, the eruption of wokeism has seemed equally sudden and cataclysmic. But in reality, like Belshazzar's fall, it's been a long time coming. But what is it? Matthew Iglesias has described it as the Great Awakening. That label is clever and perhaps, as we'll discuss later, entirely apt. A couple of years ago, Zach Goldberg did a deep dive into the woke revolution that he saw transforming American politics. What he found is that the baseline attitudes expressed by white liberals on racial and social justice questions have become radically more liberal, and the revolution in moral sentiment has led to an ideological stridency and intolerance of anyone or anything that stands in their way. This ongoing transformation has moved white liberals so far to the left on questions of race and racism that they are now to the left even of the typical Black voter. Now the woke elite, he says, act like white saviors who must lead the rest of the country, including the racial minorities whose interests they claim to represent, to a vision of justice the less enlightened groups would not choose for themselves. Because of their outsized political and cultural influence, Goldberg observes, the danger is that woke white activists acting on behalf of voiceless minorities have had their perceptions distorted by social media tinted caricatures that obscure more objective measures of reality and end up silencing or ignoring what the voiceless groups themselves have to say about what policies are in their best interests. While Goldberg finds liberals' greater concern for the outgroups and even the world as a whole praiseworthy, he admits a problem arises when those moral emotions become hyperactive and detached from objective reality. when they motivate the division of society into allies and enemies, and when they generate a level of sanctimonious outrage and judgment that places all political dissent beyond the pale. In his view, the advent of digital and social media has fomented just such a carnival of excesses. Goldberg's explanation is entirely plausible, but it seems at best naive and at worst complicit. The orgy of destruction that we saw in our streets in 2020, which woke supremacists praised and financially supported, leads me to a less benign conclusion. The totalitarian overreach of the woke supremacy is not a mistake born of excessive zeal. It is a feature. Woke doctrine is not about the good guys being innocently overzealous. It is about the imposition of an ideology, a prodigiously pernicious and divisive one. Joshua Mitchell asked a critical question. From what have the woke awakened? I will get to that in a moment. But first, what do we see if we take Goldberg's assessment at face value? All the moving parts that undergird the Great Awakening and the synergies that have made it suddenly consequential are not easy to unravel. From one perspective, this awakening may count as the fourth in a series of religious revivals. The first in the 1730s and 40s, and the second between 1790 and 1820 were the high tide of a flood of faith that brought religious renewal, challenged and changed the hearts and minds of both city dwellers and frontier settlers, and left converts with a strong sense of obligation, at first to God and then to the community at large. Rod Craig notes the revival inspired a parade of new colleges, Princeton, Columbia, Brown, Rutgers, Dartmouth, all dedicated to instilling knowledge from a biblical perspective. Despite widespread denominational diversity, philosophically, Americans expressed a broad consensus shaped by the Judeo-Christian worldview. The third awakening, the social gospel movement, 1880 to 1910, invoked religious authority to bring about political and social transformation, but seemed to have lost sight of Christianity and substituted an undifferentiated humanitarianism, which remains the idol of our age. The narrow intolerance that characterizes this newly virulent iteration of identity politics is the antithesis of the transformative community ethos that possess the souls of folks stirred by the revivals that swept across the American colonies. And though it may share some DNA with the social gospel movement, the woke may not yet realize they have merged religion and politics. Unfortunately, this is an awakening without God and without forgiveness. Let me be blunt. There is systemic racism in America. This invidious bias comes from an ironic and unexpected source. It is a phenomenon almost entirely attributable to the left and its avid spear carriers in the academy, the media, and in recent decades, the Democratic Party. I hasten to say that I do not mean to declare that there are no other bigots in America, that nothing ever occurs as a result of racial animus. But the claim of systemic, institutionalized anti-Black racism and irredeemable legacy of slavery and the Black codes is a delusion of the left, or more accurately, a deliberate distortion of the left that serves political purposes wholly unrelated to the alleged oppression of minorities, however copiously that cohort is defined. Racism is a charge that always enhances the victimology narrative, is now the most powerful ratchet in the neo-Marxist toolbox. In what felt like less than a nanosecond, America went from being a society less and less bothered by race, striving toward colorblindness, to racial obsession. We are on the path to a new and more dangerous racism, more stifling and restrictive than simple racial animus ever could be. There was a time when this society's intellectual life, its view of the universe of human nature and of aesthetics, its social and political ideas, reflected a Judeo-Christian ethic. And as President Calvin Coolidge observed on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the clergy played an indispensable role. Coolidge's speech carefully considered the underpinnings of American constitutionalism as found in the text, the sermons, and the writings of early colonial clergy who were instructing their congregations. Thus, he said, they preached equality because they believed in the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. They justified freedom by the text that we are all created in the divine image, all partakers of the divine spirit. Similarly, it was once the job of the academy to introduce students to the inspiring story of Western civilization and to enhance their respect for the cultural heritage of the West. Now, as Bruce Bauer has noted, the humanities seek to unmask the West as the perpetrator of injustice around the globe, and if the history unearthed is not damning enough, they will simply invent a more disgusting narrative. Thus, civilization is not analyzed through the use of reason or judged according to the aesthetic standards that have developed over the centuries. Rather, it is viewed through the prism of race, class, and gender, and is hailed or condemned, mostly condemned, in accordance with political checklists. The woke elites like to think of themselves as brand new, but we have seen something like this before. As confrontations over abolition heated up, Abraham Lincoln also foresaw that the unchecked growth of what he called the mobocratic spirit threatened to destroy the American Republic. The rule of the self-righteous, he warned, could destroy self-government. Lincoln and his generation succeeded in preserving the Temple of Liberty with new pillars, hewn not from the solid quarry of sober reason as he had predicted in 1837, but from a new birth of freedom that extended America's founding promise of liberty to all Americans. But as the country moved into Reconstruction, Orestes Brownson perceived a new threat. Just as Rizard Laguto would later perceive a, quote, demon in democracy, unquote, Brownson saw the infamous element in what he dubbed humanitarian democracy. He acknowledged the abolitionists were right in opposing slavery, but wrong to oppose it on humanitarian or socialist grounds. And yes, socialism was around at the end of the Civil War. The problem, he said, is that the humanitarian impulse sees the cause as superior to individuals, states, and governments, and holds that all may be trampled in pursuit of a sacred agenda. Thus, he predicted humanitarians would found, in the name of justice, a complete social despotism in which might makes right. Sound familiar? Insert social justice here, and you have a pretty good template of the world the wokerati envision. Brownson warned that humanitarians are dangerous precisely because they appear to be building on broader and deeper foundations, being more Christian, more philosophic, more generous, and philanthropic. But he warns, quote, Satan is never more successful than under the guise of an angel of light. Popular government, he concluded, depends on the virtue and intelligence of the people and thus requires fixed standards of immutable justice that could not be the constantly changing product of some unfolding and progressive historical process. In short, a dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of a rule that is not tyranny or an obedience that is not slavery. The rise of the woke supremacy is the story of what happens to a culture when subjectivism corrupts reason. And a flight from objective reality is the core of Marxism. Perhaps predictably, the proliferation of critical studies responsible for the current plague began as a repudiation of Christ and Marx. Though postmodernism is notoriously hard to define, it is generally characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism, and a general suspicion of reason. What Pluckrose and Lindsay describe as the postmodern turn is a rejection of Enlightenment values, particularly objective knowledge, universal truth, science, or evidence more broadly, as a method for obtaining objective knowledge. The power of reason, the ability to communicate straightforwardly via language, a universal human nature, and individualism. Postmodernism arrived just in time to facilitate the revival of a new and improved cultural Marxism, or to put it another way, Hegel's thoughts repackaged to take advantage of the tumult associated with the civil rights struggle and the anti-war movement. It was a perfect storm. Postmodernism might have remained no more than a detour had its radical skepticism and focus on power and hierarchies not been co-opted by cultural studies, where it morphed into social justice scholarship in capital letters, also known as applied postmodernism. Scholarship became indistinguishable from activism, and viewing everything through the lens of race, gender, and hierarchies of oppression gave rise to political correctness, trigger warnings, microaggressions, and more recently, the cancel culture. Social justice scholarship co-opted the notion of remedial justice, no caps, from the civil rights movement. But social justice is not to be conflated with the justice claims of authentic civil rights. Indeed, social justice scholarship arrived on the scene just as legal equality had largely been achieved, and anti-racist, feminist, and LGBT activism began to produce diminishing returns. More than one scholar has noted the blatantly religious overtones of woke doctrine. Professor Jonathan Haidt observed that each campus possesses adherence to a new religion, where white privilege has replaced original sin. The transgressions of class and race and gender are confessed not to priests, but to the community. Victim groups are worshiped like gods, and the sinned against are supplicated with safe spaces and trigger warnings. Haidt's observations find support in the work of postmodern intellectuals that deny objective truth. On this view, the point of words is not to exchange ideas, but to set forth a proper narrative. According to Gad Saad, many of the progressive positions espoused by social justice warriors are a form of self-flagellation meant to atone for some assumed original sin. He says most likely being a white Westerner, and to highlight one's virtuous ideological progressive purity. In this sense, SJW progressivism can almost be seen as an alternative religion to Christianity. Michael Anton says he sees in wokeness a radicalization of the Catholic teaching on original sin, only without the possibility of redemption or grace, and targeted only at those guilty of whiteness. Professor Joshua Mitchell makes the connection more explicitly, though he sees a replication of a Jewish ceremony of innocence. The Christian notion of radical equality, which is at the heart of the Declaration of Independence, is being supplanted by, he says, quote, a strange sort of anti-egalitarian spiritual eugenics, which requires the pure and innocent groups to ascend while the stained transgressor groups must be purged. Although Mitchell says identity politics has turned politics into a religious venue of sacrificial offering, the wokerati reject the sacrifice of Christ and invoke the older Jewish tradition of Passover. The Hebrews marked the doorpost of their houses with the innocent blood of a slain lamb in order that the angel of death would pass over them. Similarly, he says, in order to escape the cathartic rage of the woke mob, the usual suspects, today white male heterosexuals, must enact a version of that ritual daily, furiously signaling their innocence by showing unwavering support for social justice causes so that social death may pass over them and settle elsewhere. Alas, says Mitchell, the demand for scapegoats is insatiable. Identity politics eventually comes for everyone. And the bitterest irony is that the vast majority of Black Americans, whose moral authority has been appropriated to extend the template fashioned by the wound of slavery to women, people of color, and those gathered under the heading of LGBTQ, end up being heteronormative or cisgender offenders in a purification ritual that is perpetually searching for new victims to invoke and new scapegoats to sacrifice. In 1968, the Weather Underground declared its intention to destroy everything good and decent in America. Its boast seems on the verge of fulfillment. The Great Awakening is about the rise of a new supremacy. There have been a number of such movements in American history. All share one thing in common: recognition that America is the single greatest impediment to supreme ambitions. In all the ways that count, the woke elite are indistinguishable from other supremacists. Evan Sayet argues the enemy of the woke is not just America alone. Their true enemy is human civilization. What makes the doctrine so confusing is that it is simultaneously dedicated to refereeing purity and taint between and amongst groups, while promoting a cult of moral indiscriminateness as applied to lifestyles, cultures, and criminal opportunism. Thus, America's history and traditions are irredeemably tainted by the inky legacy of slavery. Everything which is conceivably the product of Western civilization, including mathematics, grammar, logic, rationality, and truth, and even the use of a knife and fork, are rejected as racist. At the same time, the woke actively seek to undermine all boundaries, whether national borders or moral constraints. They do nothing is right, nothing is true. But if a man believes he is a pig, that is a fact that cannot be questioned. Anyone who contradicts woke orthodoxy does so at their peril. The contradictions are mind-numbing, but arguably intentional. Being woke requires a facile command of a specialized alphabet and the catechism of an ever-evolving liturgy. Once we become familiar with the woke's street auxiliaries, BLM and Antifa, it is clear the wokerati are not well-meaning folks who have just gone a bit too far. The woke present an existential threat. They want to destroy America. They are serious about it. They seek to impose a top-down tyranny of the self-interested, narcissistic minority. They are committed to warping not just state power, but all institutions to serve private interests at public expense, and are indifferent to, indeed boastfully dismissive of, the notion of the common good. The oligarchic two-tier, anarcho-tyrannical woke America's guiding principle is never to let good crisis go to waste. As Victor Davis Hanson recently noted, the woke left now controls the media, the academy, Silicon Valley, professional sports, the corporate boardroom, the military hierarchy, the deep state, public education, and all the rest of the federal bureaucracy. As he succinctly summarizes their creed, woke revolutionaries aren't fighting against the man, they are the man. Our revolutionaries hate dissent. They destroy any who question their media-spun hoaxes. Truth is their enemy and fear is their weapon. 60s paranoid revolutionaries warned about George Orwell's 1984, but our revolutionaries are 1984. In the real world, theory with a capital T has predictably calamitous consequences. Among those untoward consequences is the rise of BLM and Antifa, the corruption of government at all levels, and the wanton destruction of what once was the world's finest system of public education. As Ravel warns, the totalitarian mindset always puts itself forward under the cover of a generous doctrine aimed at aiding the oppressed, humanitarian, inspired by concern for giving the disadvantaged their fair share, against corruption and pollution and exclusion. And these fine sentiments always end with the gulag. Rizard Laguto posits that communism and liberal democracy stem from the same historical roots in early modernity, and both exhibit a propensity toward a cult of technology and easy acceptance of social engineering as the proper means of reforming society, changing human behavior, and solving social problems. But this cannot be done outside a meticulous despotism. The Isley Brothers had the right idea. In a 1971 anthem with one of the funkiest bass lines in the annals of R&B, they exhorted listeners to fight the power. Still good advice. But as the vocalist laments, when he tries to roll with the punches, he gets knocked to the ground by all this bull, expletive deleted, going down. No one can effectively fight the power without first understanding its source. The wokerati's exact intentions are less than clear, but some things are obvious. The success of their agenda depends on mendacity and manipulation. They rely on cancel culture and the intimidation of the Twitter mob because their contentions cannot withstand the slightest scrutiny. The claims that white supremacy, implicit bias, and anti-Black racism account for all racial disparities in achievement are easily debunked. To quote Brown University Professor Glenn Lowry, the simple retort, racism is laughable, as if such disparities have nothing to do with behavior, with cultural patterns, with peer groups, with what peer groups value, with how people spend their time, with what they identify as being critical to their own self-respect. Empirical research strongly supports Professor Lowry's intuition. A 2014 Census Bureau graphic showed that WASP do not have the highest ethnic income. Indian Americans do. Indeed, 18 groups finished ahead of whites, including Taiwanese Americans and Nigerians. The Wokarati want an infantilized and frightened population over whom they may rule with minimal pushback. The socialist paradise to which they would herd us remains a dream in the misty, distant future, but they intend to fare well on the road to paradise. There is an antidote, the truth. It will take courage to speak the truth and defend the truth. It will not be easy. In the days of the Twitter mob, crossing woke lines may mean the loss of your job, your reputation, or any opportunity to be a public presence. We have all seen the craven cowering of people who have done no more than spoken the truth, but who capitulate to lies to save themselves. We must commit ourselves to speaking the truth and be prepared to accept the consequences. On this point, I favor T.S. Eliot's approach. If we take a proper view of a cause, Eliot thought we would understand there's no such thing as a lost cause because there's no such thing as a gained cause. He thought we all fight for lost causes, but because we know that our defeat and dismay may be the preface to our successor's victory. Though that victory itself will be temporary, we fight rather to keep something alive than in the expectation that anything will triumph. In other words, we fight because some things deserve to be defended and are worth whatever it costs us to do so. I count the truth among the most important of the things that deserve to be defended. And as Christopher Rufo reminds us, courage begets courage. It is easy to stop a lone dissenter. It's much harder to stop 10, 20, 100, 1,000, 1 million or more who stand up together for the principles of America. We have nothing to lose but our chains and much to be gained. Truth and justice are on our side.
Judge Brown, thank you so much for a very scholarly presentation with great historical perspective, including perspective going back to the religious revivals of the 1700s and beyond. So we've got 30 minutes for questions and answers. You will see on your screen a question and answer box, and you can type in your questions, and I will try and cover as many questions as I can. But in the meantime, I'll start off with a couple of questions. And Judge Brown, you spoke a little bit about the Marxist relationship with woke ideology. Could you explain a bit about the Marxist underpinnings of critical race theory? Just what is it?
Okay. There was a recent Heritage report that dubs CRT the grandchild of critical theory. And critical theory was the parent of critical legal theory, which you might remember. A lot of law schools took that up pretty assiduously in the 70s. But the genealogy is important because CRT is the mainspring of identity politics. And identity politics is really one of the chief afflictions of our time. But critical theory was conceived from the beginning as an attack on Western institutions and norms. And it can be traced back to a 1937 manifesto of what was called the Frankfurt School. And so the Frankfurt School was established at Columbia. in the mid-30s by a number of German scholars who had fled Nazism in Germany, came here and sought the rebirth of Hegelian thought, which had started in the upheavals of the 1840s. So Marx and Engels had promised constant revolutions by the workers of the world, but those revolutions were few and far between. So Antonio Gramsci, the founder of the Italian Communist Party, updated the Marxist orthodoxy. And what he did was really brilliant. He said, yes, all societies are divided into two groups, the privileged and the more marginalized, the oppressor and the oppressed. But he divided marginalized groups as not only the economically oppressed, but women, racial minorities, and many criminals. So those are the categories that are still with us. And that updated the Marxist orthodoxy in a way that puts us right where we are now. Because the other thing that he said, there are two ways of dominating people. One is power and coercion. The other is what he called hegemony, which is, he's saying, it's having such a control, over the values that support the class interests, that those who are marginalized actually internalize those value systems and worldviews, and thus they support the groups who are dominating them. So that was his insight, that they insist on the ideology by which, in the view of the Marxists, they are enslaved. So after the defeat of the Nazi regime, many of these scholars went back to Germany, but one who stayed was Herbert Marcuse. And he really was very effective at using Gramsci's insight. And he took advantage of the riots and violence associated with civil rights and with the anti-war movement and all of that, and realized that he had found a new agent of change, that minorities and these new categories of victims, which could be continually created, had the potential to create that constant revolution that Marx had predicted. So CRT came from critical legal theory, which came from critical theory, which came right out of the Frankfurt School.
Well, thank you for that. I must say that through my reading, what I found in a more simplistic fashion was that Marxism, of course, is based on the capitalist class oppressing the proletariat.
Right.
And by the second half of the 20th century, a number of Marxist socialist scholars were finding that this theory wasn't really working very well, and the workers were not revolting against the capitalist class. And they decided, well, we'll just change who the oppressors are and who the oppressed are, as you point out, and make the oppressors white males and the oppressed women and minorities. And suddenly that seemed to catch on as a way of using the Marxist model, but in a different fashion. Let me ask you another question, then we'll turn to some of the questions we've got from our audience. So you spoke about how Victor Davis Hanson noted that now the woke ideology controls academia, the media, government bureaucracies, and so on. So how do you think all this happened? How did this woke ideology gain such influence? And as you note, particularly at a time when the civil rights movement in the 1960s and the legislation, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, seemed to address through enforcement a non-discrimination policy in the United States. So how did this woke ideology gain such influence and spread so greatly through so many institutions in the country?
It is not entirely clear to me, but I've always thought that the 60s were really pivotal in the spread of this. And in part, there was a lot of student unrest at that time, a lot of universities, some of them infamously so, gave way to student demands. And a lot of those demands included changing the curriculum. And Bruce Bauer says in the Victims' Revolution that suddenly we had all of these studies, but one of the first of those was what was called, the legal crits, right? Critical legal theory. And that gave support to a lot of, so there was, critical race theory, and then there was feminist theory, and then there was Chicano studies, and, then there were queer studies, and on it went. And I think initially, the Academy really felt embarrassed and somewhat dismayed because they had been guilty of overlooking what was a real problem. The bad old days of de jure discrimination and the Black codes and all of that. That really happened, and they had ignored it. And so the civil rights movement brought all of that to their attention, and then their own children, criticized them for having been passive in the face of this great moral wrong. And so I think that they wanted to, to be inclusive, to be responsive to what was being said. But at the same time, they abandoned every kind of standard of, academic rigor or, requiring people to know whereof they spoke. And so that created that vacuum into which critical theory seemed to fit very happily. And so for a while, I think they thought, well, that's fine. We can talk about all those things in the Academy, but they didn't expect it to escape, but it did. And so for many reasons, in part because you were educating all of these people, in social justice scholarship and so forth, and they were going out into the world and taking jobs and, becoming human resource directors and doing all these kinds of things. So that orthodoxy was spreading. So I think that's one explanation of it. I think there are others.
All right, thank you. So here's a question from the audience. Do you agree with John McWhorter that wokeism for white liberals is a religion? I think you kind of alluded to that a bit in your presentation, but maybe you can expound on that. So do you agree with John McWhorter about wokeism for white liberals as a religion?
I don't know that they understand it to be, informed by some sort of religious sensibility. But I must say that I was really very struck by Joshua Mitchell's view of this. He says it's not just virtue signaling, it's innocence signaling. And you've got to do that all the time because it's a moving target. And, you kind of, one of the things Douglas Murray says in The Madness of Crowds is you're walking through a minefield, right? You never know when it's going to detonate. And so you're always trying to avoid getting blown up. And so, but there does seem to be, and just about every commentator and every author that I have seen who has taken a hard look at this has actually seen something in it that looks like a religion. Some of them say, it's not quite a religion because, they don't acknowledge transcendence. But I think you can have, if you define a religion functionally as just, that doctrine that helps you answer the hard questions, right? All those things that don't have easy answers, then it's operating very much like a religion. It's just that their answers are terrible.
All right. So here's another question. Why do you suppose so many principled and dedicated Democrats have hitched their wagons to wokeism? And the questioner notes, surely they realize how dangerous this is and how, like Robespierre, it can backfire upon them.
Well, that is a great question. I really, really struggled to understand what's happening. And at first I thought, well, maybe there are still people in the Democratic Party who are simply honorable liberals, and they just don't pay enough attention to know that this is going on, because many of us, even those of us who pay attention to such things and are, concerned about politics and the trends and trying to, read the tea leaves, I think it came as something of a shock when all of this really started to become a conflagration in 2020. So I could see up to that point, not quite understanding what was going on. I know a lot of people, a slogan like Black Lives Matter, that must have seemed to a lot of people like something that was simply, obvious. Who could be against that? It's like motherhood and apple pie, right? So I could see that being, somewhat of a stealth movement, but I can't understand it now. I mean, I think it's now so blatant. There's so clearly articulated their hostility to the country, their, real rage against American principles, the idea of equality, the idea of government neutrality. All of these things they utterly reject, and they say so. And there's nothing about it that is, somehow secretive. So I think maybe it's just that they're now looking at a situation in which everyone that they listen to, the media, the academy, the professional sports, business leaders, everyone seems to be saying, yeah, that's right. We're all in agreement with this. And so I suspect that it's very hard when people think that public opinion is pervasive, for them to have a different view.
All right. So for those who are concerned, as you are, about the spread of woke ideology and critical race theory, what can be done to respond to its growing influence? Now, you noted that, in your presentation that truth was an antidote. Can you be any more specific as to what sorts of things can be done or argued to try and address the spreading influence of woke ideology and critical race theory?
I think probably some things cannot be done. It has areas of that seem to be very strong support in many places where you would not expect it to be, and it probably is not prudent to attack that directly. Because, for people who are at the beginning of their careers or, have lots to lose, I think it's very difficult. So I'm not suggesting that people be foolhardy. On the other hand, I think, courage is the most important virtue. And so there's a book out now by Rod Dreher called Live Not by Lies. And what Dreher is doing in that book is simply discussing something that Solzhenitsyn did when he was exiled from the Soviet Union. He wrote an essay for the people of Russia which was translated roughly, live not by lies. And what he was saying to them was, you may not have any choice about, being stuck in the kingdom of lies. You may not be able to change the fact that that's where you are. But what you can change is how you handle it. And one of those things is to never validate it by acting as if you believe it. To always, speak truthfully, don't play the game. And so I think that's the point that I was trying to make. And it seems to me that there are real weaknesses in what they're doing. It is possible for people to understand. I think one of the things that we're seeing now is when this was in higher ed, people sort of said, well, that's kind of craziness, we expect it. But when they start pushing it into K through 12 and parents understood what they were doing, they rose up and said, no, you're not going to teach that to my child. And so I think there's a real value just in, always confronting it, not letting it slide by, not being passive in the face of it. And I mean, there are other things too that might help. But if you're just talking about, wokeism, that seems to me the most effective thing is to just don't let it go unchallenged, because they're saying things that are, really antithetical to everything that has made America a great country. And if they succeed, there will no longer be self-government, because what they mean by equity is not what the founders meant by equality. And that would require what Brownson was saying, meticulous despotism. It would require some government agency or many, right, to basically penalize and handicap people so that they could have this equitable outcome. That's what they're talking about.
I suppose looking at it from another perspective, the underlying principle of the American Republic is that all people are created equal and every person should be judged on their individual merit and not based on the class or classification of which they're a part. And critical race theory is in complete contradiction to the concept that you judge people based on their merit, not on their race or class or gender. And so it is basically a theory that's contrary to the underlying principle of this republic. And I am reminded of something that Ronald Reagan said. He said, you can go to Japan, but you're not going to become Japanese. You can go to France, but you're not going to become French. He said, but everybody can come to the United States and become an American. And I guess the point is that this country is based on a diverse group of people from all over the world. And so we don't have a nationality, or let me put it this way, we don't have an ethnicity that unites us. The only thing that unites this country, unlike, say, Japan or France or Germany, the only thing that unites us is our underlying principles, our philosophy of equal rights, of being based on your merit. And, if you've got a theory that attacks those underlying principles, then you really don't have an America, because the only thing America is an idea. If you destroy the idea, you destroy America.
Oh, that is very true. And Coolidge, in a wonderful speech that he gave on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration, says something very like that. He says, if all men are created equal, that is final. If they're endowed by their creator with unalienable rights, that is final. If the only legitimate government is the government by consent of the people. That is funny. He says you can't challenge those determinations, and anybody who seeks to do that is not able to claim progress. They are regressive. They are going backwards. So I think that's the answer. And I think people, when they really understand what's being said, not just, the words can be so glib, and words can change their meaning. So, I think in this country, a claim of racism has great resonance. Nobody wants to be called a racist. We're, way beyond that. And so, but when people understand what's being said, when Ibram Kendi says, how to be an anti-racist, and then he says the way to do that, is more discrimination, that should make you pause.
Right. He says that the remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination.
It's present discrimination.
Right. And the remedy for present discrimination is future discrimination, which overlooks the fact that one generation isn't supposed to pay the price of what a prior generation
did. Yeah.
It moves away from treating people as individuals and to be judged on their individual attributes, as opposed to looking at them as part of a class or group of immutable characteristics. So why don't I ask you one last question? You made some reference to the fact that the woke ideology rejects reason, rejects Enlightenment principles, and there was a recent column in the Wall Street Journal that quoted from Richard Delgado, who apparently is one of the founders of critical race theory and has written a book called Critical Race Theory: An Introduction. And he says in his book that critical race theory, quote, questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. So he says it even questions neutral principles of constitutional law. Are these concepts essential to woke ideology and critical race theory? In other words, are these views integral, so that you cannot accept critical race theory or woke ideology without questioning and rejecting equality theory, legal reasoning, neutral principles, constitutional law, the Enlightenment? I mean, is it just integral to the theory?
I think it is, because what's really being said here, when you go back to the way that cultural Marxism works, is to say that you always have the oppressed and the oppressor. That score is never settled. You never get to a point where you're not playing victimology poker, as it were. And so you can't have a government that's neutral in that circumstance. You have the innocent and the guilty must be punished. And so the whole idea of neutrality on the part of government just has to go away. Government has to be constantly, in fact, intervening and rebalancing, the portfolio of good and evil. That's just how that has to work. They utterly reject. In fact, I believe I have come across something where Kendi says that neutrality itself is racist. So yeah, I think those are irreconcilable.
All right, one last question before we close, and that is that you talked about equity as a viewpoint of critical race theory and woke ideology. What is equity in that ideology as compared to equality? Because the equity sounds great. Sounds like why wouldn't you against equity?
It does. I think most people think it's kind of the same thing as equality. And the meme now is diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI. And so you have to swear your allegiance to that if you want to be hired in most places now. But what they mean by equity is totally different from what the founders are saying when they talk about equality. What they are saying is we are all equal because we're human beings, and thus no one is born naturally a slave, and no one is born with the right to rule. And so the only legitimate government is a government that is based on the consent of the people. Therefore, the only legitimate government is self-government. Equity is saying something very different. It's talking about not equality under the law or even equality of opportunity, but equality of outcome. And it's talking about equality of outcome, not even as to individuals, but as to groups. So, so the idea being that some organ, some office of government should be in the business of making sure that everybody has equal outcomes. And you can't do that without complete despotism. You have to be able to completely control people's lives to bring about that notion of equity.
Well, thank you. So I'd like everyone to give a virtual round of applause to Judge Brown. So thank you very much for your presentation today. And I'd like to remind our viewers that if you're interested in PRI or learning more about PRI, you can visit the website, which is www.pacificresearch.org. And let me remind you also that PRI has a weekly podcast called The Next Round and a blog called Right by the Bay. We also come out with all kinds of papers, as I've said at the very outset of this presentation, on healthcare, the environment, economics and business, the environment, California reforms. And let me finally remind you that PRI is holding its annual gala at the Ritz-Carlton on October 2. And that'll be in San Francisco. And the keynote speaker is Mark Levin. So you can get more information about that on the PRI website as well. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. So thank you and good afternoon.
Thanks, Dan.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.